in reflecting on this kind of moment as a pandemic that has, truly shaken our world, we're now speaking a lot as we kind of look forward into the question of, what is a new normal? What is life going to look like after the pandemic? Which is likely still to be, a fair way in the distance while we kind of look at vaccination. And this is kind of where I see the point of kind of climate change coming in. So our old normal was not setting us up to be on kind of a pathway that would minimize global warming and allow us to tackle climate change in a just and equitable way at the kind of speed we need it to. So when we're talking about kind of a new normal, we need to kind of figure out, okay, what do we need to change that will help us meet these kind of ambitious climate action goals, and make sure that we're not in another situation that kind of drives global disarray and chaos and really impacts people in such a negative way. And so this point of kind of like a new normal, we need to kind of endeavor to look at kind of how can we learn lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. So how can we further kind of draw together and focus on collective action and collaboration to tackle climate goals and make sure that we're not seeing the negative impacts of climate change affect particular communities and not doing anything about it. So how do we continue with this idea of coming together to drive action and embedding some approaches that will tackle inequities? Because as I'm sure like you all know on this call, climate change is not going to affect everyone in the same way. We're going to see lots of different impacts across the world, and it will kind of, at a great scale, disadvantage those already in some disadvantaged positions to begin with. And I think when the kind of pandemic was sort of kicking off, at least in Europe, we obviously saw it start, at the end of 2019. In Asia, there were lots of these questions about, how would that affect global emissions? So we're saying, okay, people aren't flying, you're not going on your transatlantic holiday, you're not okay, so business travel has like rapidly decreased. People, are working from home, they're not working in offices, and all those kind of things are sort of changing, the usage of fossil fuels and things in different ways. So we kind of, I think, maybe expected, a year ago to be, okay, well, we'll see a great drop in emissions to do with flights, or it will change, how our energy used to do with buildings. But what's actually happened is we've realized how much of like a small proportion of our global emissions those things represent. And also it's revealed some of the inefficiencies. I mean, finance is a really big question. It's also a really interesting part of tackling the climate crisis. So for background, I joined EFEG at the beginning of the year with a focus on sustainable finance. And before I did that, I worked as a sustainability consultant. So I worked with companies to try and get them to become more responsible and sustainable. It's very interesting, gave me lots of great insights into how you actually get these decisions through business. And one of the most important things is what they were being told to do by their investors, by private finance, by these financial institutions that were investing in them and had therefore this interest in what they were doing about sustainability. So if an investor came to them and was like, we need to know what you're doing about your supply chain emissions, they would then be like, oh, okay, we need to really figure out what we're doing about our supply chain emissions. So like finance has a really big role to play in the private sphere in terms of driving change from other companies. But there's also a real need for finance in the context of a sort of better green recovery to also be coming from the governments. So we need to see climate action being embedded at the heart of domestic recovery plans. It can't just be that these recovery plans are focused purely on growth and economic recovery in a very traditional sense. It needs to be, as I was saying earlier, this point of reflection and change. So we need to see climate action embedded in these explicitly, and that these plans themselves are then backed up by financing plans for net zero commitments and for resilience. And also a vital part of the kind of green recovery from a financial perspective is ending public financing of fossil fuels. as I was saying, private finance also has like a really important role to play in a green recovery. And I think we're starting to see that play out, particularly over the last year or so. So what we need to see from private finance to kind of get this green recovery and to get meaningful action on climate over the next few years is we need to see financial institutions making robust net zero commitments. So we need to see them having, near-term targets to be demonstrating, what are they going to do, not just between now and 2050, but between, now and 2030. What are they actually going to do, and how are they decarbonizing their value chains and their investment portfolios? And as part of this, there's a real need for them to, explicitly say, what they're doing, and to demonstrate how they're trying to transition to sort of a low carbon economy. And kind of mirroring my point on the mobilization of finance from like developed countries to developing countries, that's also something we're looking to see from private finance. In addition to kind of making commitments about reducing their own emissions, we're also looking to see private finance make commitments for themselves to finance climate action and adaptation in developing countries. So making sure that this kind of, people say there's one, transitioning finance, so making finance greener, net zero, and there's also a piece which is financing the transition. So the flows of finance basically need to be kind of going all the way around as being green and also as funding green. But this isn't going to happen necessarily easily. It's something that we kind of have to work against decades of how the economic system has, prioritized just plain growth over kind of these greener aspects or aspects concerned to like social aspects as well. So what we're probably going to need is some really strong signals from governments. So as I'm saying before, so as we were hoping for governments to put, climate action at the heart of their domestic recovery plans, they also need to then back that up with what the messages they're sending to private finance. So making sure that private finance knows that they're being like supported and encouraged to sort of make these less traditional, decisions to do with their portfolios, and making sure that there's regulation and financing strategies in place at a domestic level that will support private finance in making these like changes to kind of how they do business, essentially, because it will require change at such a scale. And I think we might go on to it a bit later, but we essentially need a whole of economic system change, which is not going to come easily and is a very complicated problem to try and solve, but one that we really need to if we're going to drive climate action at the scale we really need to. The issues of enforcement are also really interesting. So we saw in the UK the move to make TCFD, so the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, sort of incorporated as a mandatory requirement for financial related sort of risk reporting for companies. And once you kind of look into the detail of it, there were kind of limited provisions made for what that looks like in terms of enforcement. So there's actions for them asking for you to report, for companies to report on their climate related risks across governance strategy, metrics and targets, and the risks themselves, but there wasn't necessarily a mechanism in place to actually hold these companies to account if what they were reporting wasn't sufficient, if it wasn't detailed, and it wouldn't therefore then help financial actors make climate informed decisions. So I think this issue of enforcement, when we're looking at kind of, what does good climate disclosure look like, what does good climate action look like, is a really big question that needs to be tackled on a global scale. And I think the idea is very cynical, but if there isn't, an expectation that there will be, that you'll be reprimanded or there'll be kind of, financial penalties if you're not reporting or taking action in line with, what you've agreed to. I do feel that sometimes, you can't expect actors to actually move forward with that if they're not completely bought into it at a conceptual level. So I think the issue of enforcement across kind of all aspects of climate disclosure, climate goals is a really big question. I think one we'll need to grapple with in the kind of the details, the nitty-gritty of it over the next 3 years, particularly as we look to kind of really scale up the speed of climate action that is required if we're going to reduce warming by as much as possible.